Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Co-Creators Convergence Thursday night combos. This is a place where we assemble every Thursday night. It's a space where, by invitation and self-invitation, people bring their gifts to the shift in humanity. And tonight we are delighted to have Mike Frisch with us, bringing his gift, one of his gifts, to the shift in humanity, and talking to us about a long journey, that journey of African astronomy and its contribution to the world. We're so happy to have you with us here tonight, Mike. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Bob.
We appreciate you being here. So my name is Bob Warner. I'm one of the stewards of the Co-Creators Convergence, along with my beloved Noelle Marshall, who's riding shotgun this evening in the right seat, helping us with the tech. She threw me into the left seat for one evening. And so this is going to be a wonderful evening of education, contribution, and conversation. Looking forward to our conversations after Mike's presentation, questions, answers, comments, and thoughts. Wonderful to have everyone with us. So some of you who are viewing this may be unfamiliar with the Co-Creators Convergence. And so we're going to make a little 1 minute plus video introduction to the space that you're in tonight, the Co-Creators Convergence. So stand by, and I'm going to share my screen with a little short video, and then we'll get started. So I'm back. Thank you. That's a little bit about the Co-Creators Convergence. Thank you, Noelle, for your help. And again, we're delighted to have Mike with us this evening, a subject that's completely new for us, a piece of the world's history that we need to know about, but don't know about. And as I chatted with Mike, I'll introduce him a little bit more in a moment, but as I chatted with Mike before we started, we agreed that it may be an appropriate centering for us, a grounding moment for all of us this evening, would be a fire ritual that's common to the community of Dominator in northern Italy. And that is that of a fire ritual. It seems so appropriate for tonight's subjects. And so I would invite all of us to imagine for a moment a flame on a candle. And with your eyes open, look upon this flame, and as you gaze at the flame, imagine all the mysteries, the wisdoms, and the stories that came before this moment. We're going to learn about so much of that tonight. Remember now that when we light the fire, it is the same fire lit around the world and throughout time. This flame that connects you to all of the mysteries of the past, the mysteries of the present, the mysteries of the future. As we greet this elemental fire, we recognize the masculine energy, the hot fire of the sun. We also recognize the feminine energy, the cool fire of the moon. This fire, the flame dancing on our candle, is the witness of our gathering and a mirror of the divine spark within, our internal flame. We work in the light of this flame as the eternal flame supporting us in our collective becoming, knowledge, and illumination. Let's breathe into that for a moment. And again, I am very excited to welcome Mike to the evening. Mike has had a lifelong journey of astronomy, beginning all the way back when he went on a high school trip to an observatory and was just amazed at what he saw, that 60-foot reflective telescope and the photos of that which was out through the cosmos. I got to tell you, this guy is more knowledgeable than anyone else in our immediate life with what's going on with the James Webb Telescope. He is all over it. And it's just been a lifelong adventure for him since high school. And what he's going to present this evening is titled A Long Journey, African Astronomy Contribution. And we have really, really been looking forward to this, Mike.
And thank you for inviting me. I've been looking forward very much to this. We're going to talk about Africa, astronomy as it's evolved in Africa. It's at a very exciting starting point right now. And we're also going to do a little bit of archaeology and geography and climatology on Africa because it all blends together. But the end of the presentation ends up in South Africa, which is turned into a very progressive country as far as astronomy is concerned. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. Okay, we're going to talk about some different parts of Africa, as I mentioned before, and a few other sciences lightly before we get into astronomy. But I do want to take you into Africa as it was about 7,500 years ago in the desert, and take you down to a place. And hopefully you can follow my cursor here. Out in the desert, about 600 miles south of Cairo, 60 miles from the Nile River, and a place where something extraordinary was found. Okay. We'll go from there into several other countries where astronomy actually began to develop. Some very interesting things happened in what is now the Middle East and Eastern Africa. They really were the start of formal astronomy as far as the world was concerned. And then we are going to end up in some very exciting things that happened in South Africa and are ongoing and really point the way forward. So I'm ready to take off on this, and let's proceed. Let's go way back. Homo sapiens, or people kind as we know it, if you looked at what the archaeologists and anthropologists were telling us 20 years ago, really came to be known at about 200,000 years ago. But some very recent finds in places like Morocco have pushed that back about 100,000 years. So wherever we're talking about in Africa, I think the point is that most people kind, mankind, if you will, I like to call it people kind, came out of Africa. At first, of course, the Yerkes did an impressive job of down in Southeast Africa and made some wonderful discoveries. But within the last 20 years, they've made some extraordinary discoveries in Ethiopia, and more specifically and more prolifically in Morocco, where in 3 or 4 sites, one right on the coast, on the ocean, where they found Homo sapiens where we didn't know they were before. And it's pushed the timeline way back to first finds of about 300,000 years ago. But I think the real point there is that peoplekind came out of Africa. And when they came out of Africa, whether they started in Northern Africa and traveled south, or as this older chart, which is one of the only ones I could find on the subject, shows, there it is, coming out of South Africa. We can live with that. Know that travel throughout Africa, north and south, was very active starting 200,000 years ago. We're talking about migration, we're talking about trade routes, we're talking about mutual regional support, where salt would come from South Africa down in, North Africa, the North African deserts, down into South Africa, where salt gets scarcer and scarcer, excuse me, as you go south. Travel went into the Arabian Peninsula about 100,000 years ago, reached Europe about 40,000 years ago, India 70,000 years, Eurasia 25,000 years ago, Australia and the South Seas 30 to 50,000 years ago, and across the land bridge, across between Russia and Alaska, about 15,000 years ago, and then down into the US about 12,000 years ago. So the migration routes are pretty clear and pretty well documented, as many of the people jumped off the migration routes and integrated with the peoples of all these areas. I think it's safe to say that most of us still have some African genes in our body. So the place we're talking about is called Nabta Playa. It's the world's first known astronomical site. I've already located it for you. It's in the desert, about 600 miles south of Cairo, and was unknown until about 1970, when it was stumbled upon. But I'll give you a little more history on that in just a minute. Just to chronologically go forward, Nabta Playa has been dated, carbon dated, about 7,500 years old. If you look at other astronomical sites around the world, Mexico, Chichen Itza is about 2,000 years old. Machu Picchu, only 550 years old. The first known site in China about 3,800 years ago, and Stonehenge has been dated about 5,000 years ago. We're going to move around on the map a little today. We're going to start at Nabta Playa, talk about some of the educated players in the as far as countries are concerned, and we're going to find out that the Mediterranean rim, and in particular crossing over the rim into the Middle East, and that Iraq and Iran were extremely active after the birth of Christ, going specifically active about 600 AD up through about 1000 AD. Also, we're going to go to a place that's really little known and little talked about, but toward the end of our presentation, we're going to be talking about Mali, and specifically Timbuktu, which plays a big part in African history and in the history of the sciences and astronomy in particular. We'll end up today in South Africa and talk about what South Africa and 8 other countries in South Africa are doing to further the science and bring some real exciting things to a relatively new part of astronomy called radio astronomy. Well, we'll get into that in a little bit. Let's go back here a second. For thousands of years, ancient societies all around the world erected massive stone circles, aligning them with the sun and stars to mark the seasons. These early calendars foretold the coming of spring, summer, fall, and winter, helped civilizations track when to plant and when to harvest. They also served as ceremonial sites, both for celebration and sacrifice. These megaliths, large prehistoric monuments made of stone, may seem mysterious in our modern era, when many people lack a connection with or even view of the stars. Some even hold them as supernatural or divined by aliens. But many ancient societies kept time by tracking which constellations rose at sunset, like reading a giant celestial clock. And others pinpointed the sun's location in the sky on the summer and winter solstice, the longest and shortest days of the year, or the spring and fall equinox. Europe alone holds about 35 megaliths, including many astronomically aligned stone circles, as well as tombs and other standing stones. These structures were mostly built between 6,500 and 4,500 years ago, largely along the Atlantic and Mediterranean coasts. The most famous of these sites, of course, is Stonehenge, a monument in England that's thought to be around 5,000 years old. Though still old at that age, Stonehenge may have been one of the youngest such stone structures to be built in Europe. The chronology and extreme similarities between these widespread European sites lead some researchers to think the regional tradition of constructing megaliths first emerged along the coast of France. It was then passed across the region, eventually reaching Great Britain. But even these primitive sites are at least centuries younger than the world's oldest known stone circle, Nabta Playa. Located in Africa, Nabta Playa stands about 600 miles south of the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt. It was built more than 7,000 years ago, making Nabta Playa the oldest stone circle in the world and possibly Earth's oldest astronomical observatory. It was constructed by a cattle-worshipping cult of nomadic people to mark the summer solstice and the arrival of monsoons. Here is human beings' first attempt to make some serious connection with the heavens, said Dr. McKim Maltville, a professor emeritus at the University of Colorado and an archaeoastronomy expert. In the 1960s, Egypt was planning a major dam project along the Nile that was going to flood important archaeological sites. UNESCO stepped in with funding to help relocate famous structures, as well as scour the area for new sites before they were lost forever. But a prominent American archaeologist named Fred Wendorf saw another opportunity. He wanted to search for the ancient origins of pharaonic Egypt away from the Nile River. While everyone was looking for temples, he said, he would look in the desert. He opened up the area of pre-dynastic Egypt and the ancient kingdom. By luck, in 1973, a Bedouin or nomadic Arab named Edie Marif came across a group of what looked like large stone megaliths while crossing the Sahara. Marif took Wendorf, whom he had worked for since the 1960s, out to the site, which sits about 60 miles away from the Nile River. Ramoud Shield, Wendorf's longtime friend and collaborator, remembers the discovery story a little bit differently. He says the entire team was driving across the desert when they stopped for a rest break, and there was evidence of megalith remains lying right up on the surface. At first, Wendorf thought they were natural formations, but he soon realized that the site was once a large lake bed that would have destroyed any such rocks. He would return many times over the course of decades. Then, during excavations in the early 1990s, Wendorf and a team of excavators, including Polish archaeologist Ramud Shield, uncovered a circle of stones that seemed to be aligned with the stars in some mysterious way. After 7 years without being able to track or crack the mystery, Wendorf called in Maltville, an expert in archaeoastronomy. He was out of the American Southwest. Melville says he too was puzzled when he first looked at the maps of the ancient site. He knew he had to travel there in person to get a sense of the place, as well as its creators and celestial significance. They drove across the flat sandy landscape until they reached a large sand dune beside a dry lake bed, where views stretched out to the horizon. There they pitched their tents and set up a camp, and while Malville sat in the sand beside the stones, he said he experienced an epiphany. I discovered that these stones were part of an alignment that radiated out from a major tumulus or burial ground. A pile of these megaliths formed the covering of a tomb, and it turned out that every one of the megaliths that we found buried in the sediment formed a line, like spokes in a wheel radiating out. The team had already performed radiocarbon dating on the site by taking samples from fire hearths and tamarisk roofing material found inside the stone circle. He discovered that the stone circle once aligned to Arcturus, Sirius, and Alpha Centauri, and there were also stones that seemed to correspond with the constellation Orion. By tracing back Arcturus's movement across the night, they proposed that the star would have matched up with Nabta Playa's stone circle around 4,800 BC. Their analysis was published in the news journal Nature in 1998. It drew global headlines. The headlines ran, "Stonehenge in the Sahara." In the decades since then, archaeologists have continued to unravel the mystery of the ancient people of Nabta Playa, who used their summer home to observe the stars. The research done by astrophysicist Thomas Brady suggests that these monoliths might tell much more. The cantilever circle itself is made up of one doorway that runs north and south, and another doorway that runs southwest to northeast. These mark the summer solstice. Plus, there are 6 center stones. Brophy's hypothesis, first, that the southerly line of 3 stones inside the calendar circle represented the 3 stars of Orion's belt. And the other 3 stones inside the circle represented the shoulders and head stars of Orion as they appeared in the sky at that time. These correspondences were for 2 dates, circa 4800 BC and at precessional opposition, representing how the sky moves long term. Brophy proposes that the circle was constructed and used circa the latter date, and the dual date representation was a conceptual representation of the motion of the sky over a precession cycle. And we'll talk about precession in just a few minutes. Nearby the calendar circle, which is made of smaller stones, there are alignments of large megalith stones. The southerly lines of these megaliths, Brophy shows, align to the same stars as represented in the calendar circle, all in the same epoch, circa 6270 BC. The calendar circle correlation with Orion's belt occurred between 6400 BC and 4900 BC, matching the radiocarbon dating or campfires around the circle. Because, excuse me, because Nabta lies near the Tropic of Cancer, the noon sun is at its zenith about 3 weeks before and 3 weeks after the summer solstice, preventing upright objects from casting shadows. These vertical sighting stones in the circle correspond to the zenith sun during the summer solstice, said Melville, an archaeoastronomer at the University of Colorado. For many cultures in the tropics, the zenith sun has been a major event for millennia. 2 pairs of upright stones stand directly across the circle from each other, defining the view that would have displayed sunrise at the summer solstice. The circle also contains 2 other pairs of standing stones that defined a north-south view. Who are these people that founded Nabta and that were long-term interrupted by drought period times when they became migrants, but then returned after the droughts were over and actually formed a community at Nabta? Well, the clues they have been unearthed. They were migratory at times, but they did build wood huts covered with leaves that were sunk in the ground, had fire pits. They evidently used superstition or religion, what their beliefs were, to bury the people that died in specific positions. The burial pits held some of their artwork and possessions, and they found many of these burial mounds. Also, these people were evidently cattle worshippers because they buried their cattle in a similar way, all in the same position, all oriented in the same direction, in clay chambers, just as the human burials were. So the cattle apparently were sacred to them. As a matter of fact, in their digging, they unearthed what is almost certainly a form of cattle cut into stone in a rudimentary way, but it was huge. And you can see the block and tackle it took to get it out of the ground where it was buried, and the size of it when it was unearthed completely. So for a primitive people who didn't know the wheel at that time, this was quite an understanding. This was quite an effort. The people were fairly advanced. Their pottery had some interesting patterns on it, probably carved into the pottery with fishbone combs, and they're very attractive patterns, and these are found all across the area. These people at first were hunter-gatherers. They hunted the gazelle, the giraffe, and other animals usually found further south in Africa. However, the weather was quite a bit different than the desert that we see here today. Today, the Sahara area has little or no rainfall. In these days, 7,000 years ago, rainfall was probably about 20 to 25 inches a year. So there was plentiful grass. The climate was much more humid than it is today. And there were potentially some trees that they found some wood, that a lot of wood that they had been burning, wood used in the construction of their huts. So the area was much different than it was today. And we'll look at some of the reasons why. They grew grains, they ate cattle, and the animals that they hunted in the desert. Today, although Western Egypt is totally dry, this was not always the case. There's excellent evidence that there were several humid periods in the past with up to 500 millimeters of rain would fall per year. The most recent one, and during the last interglacial age, were periods that stretched between 130,000 and 70,000 years ago. During this time, the area was a savanna and supported numerous animals, including extinct buffalo and very large giraffes, as well as antelope and gazelle. Beginning around the 10th millennium BCE, the region of the Nubian desert began to receive more rainfall, even more rainfall, filling a lake. Early people may have been attracted to this region due to the source of water. Now, if you look at today's, let's look at from a climatological standpoint. Today's desert, today's Sahara is dry, as well as the Saudi Peninsula, the Arabian Peninsula. There's basically one river that runs through it. It's the Nile River. And the rest of Africa is, as we know it, tropical near the equator, and then subtropical, and then temperate as we get into southeastern Africa, with the desert appearing on the western side of Africa, caused by a western wind that comes in and goes over some mountains near the coast and dries this desert area out. The Africa of 7,000 years ago is, as we just discussed, it was much more humid. It brought grass and trees into the area. This was a savanna. It gets more heavily treed as the greens get darker on the map. And you can see tropical Africa was also extended, vastly extended. What's quite interesting when you look at another map, bear with me a second. Okay, let's take a look at this. This is Africa climatologically today, 10,000 years ago, and about 127,000 years ago. As you can see, we have a savanna existing in the entire Sahara area. Over 100,000 years ago, almost the same thing about 10,000 years ago, except in some very dry areas at the top. And if you want to, you can look at these. This rain is in millimeters, and here's a scale that converts millimeters to inches of rainfall. And interestingly, in areas here where you get in the middle of the Sahara, and if you Nabta is about right here, and Nabta and points north have averagely less than an inch of rain a year today. They would be having 10,000 years ago, 250 millimeters, or about 7 or 8 inches of rainfall, and significantly more than that, maybe as much as 12 inches of rain a year, certainly enough for grass. More importantly, the area was crisscrossed with seasonal and some year-round rivers, streams, and even lakes. And the remnant of this lake at this location exists today. So the area was very much different and quite conducive to settlement in the time periods that we're talking about. Well, Nabta has moved. As soon as it was discovered, the word got out and the coordinates on the map were published. It being a relatively short drive across the desert, people started to flock to it, and the same type of vandalism that we see in the United States and all over the world started to happen to Nabta. So the Egyptian Department of Antiquities moved Nabta, and now it sits in part of the Nubian Museum in very good company. It was built as Aswan developed, and it's been erected as it was found originally. It makes a beautiful display right outside the walls to the museum. Okay. All right, now we're going to go down a little bit further south into an area of Central and Western Africa, into some ancient kingdoms that existed from about roughly the year 600 forward. And I'm talking about into the current period. We're talking about Mali, Ghana, and Songhai. Songhai no longer exists as a country or a kingdom. These were actually kingdoms. Ghana and Mali are in different locations. Ghana is in a different location. Mali is much the same geographically. These were kingdoms that had great natural resources. They were in an area where there was significant moisture. They had thriving populations. They were rich in natural resources as far as gold was concerned, which became the way what was used in trade. In point of fact, the kingdoms in Ghana, Mali, and Songhai succeeded in these time periods. Mali was the longest lived. They existed from 800 up until after Columbus landed, until about 1550. Songhai, probably the shortest lived, from the 1200 to 1600. And Ghana was the first to emerge as a kingdom from 700 until about 1100. There was more wealth in these three kingdoms than any country in Europe at the time. There was a high degree of trade. Salt from the desert, again, was a prime commodity. Salt gets scarce as you go further south. So salt was traded for gold and white gold, unfortunately, ivory that came out of these areas. So there was a lot of trade north and south through these kingdoms and the rest of Africa. Some of that trade was actually with European countries too. And as you can see in this period here, the European countries were seafaring enough where they could come down and pick up products along the coast. Now, Africa has a thriving history of scholarship where astronomy played an integral role, notably in Timbuktu. In Timbuktu, thousands of scrolls and manuscripts written in ancient Arabic and other local languages tracked scholastic endeavors of these three major countries. These manuscripts are called the Timbuktu manuscripts, and they cover the year starting about 600 up until virtually current times. And as this was a very wealthy area, Timbuktu is located roughly in this area on the map. The kings of these three areas financed education and learning. The manuscripts that were written at that time are preserved, and they actually go back almost to the year 700. There was about, as far as the estimates are concerned, 600,000 sets of manuscripts generated and preserved in the area. Not having any institutions that could save them, they were saved in people's homes in Timbuktu until within the last 100 years. Coming fast forward, some of the Western countries have started to become aware of this and help the people in Mali preserve their heritage. There's the manuscripts, unfortunately, were not safe. When Al-Qaeda and the other Islamic insurgents started to come forward, they came into Mali. There were manuscripts burned, just as in Iran and Iraq. You probably remember they took some of the most precious monuments and buildings and destroyed them. So luckily, a significant number of manuscripts were smuggled to safety from Timbuktu after the Islamist militant groups took control of the city in 2012. The centuries of African knowledge and scholarships ranged from math through religion, philosophy, astronomy, astrology, and history, and they're precious. Google has played an enormous role in helping to preserve the Timbuktu manuscripts electronically. However, translating hundreds of thousands of documents into contemporary languages remains an ongoing challenge. These are examples of some of the manuscripts, and I think some of them may be pretty important because it appears, if you look at this, they had developed a calendar and perhaps two types of calendars. Although I certainly don't really read Arabic, I would love to see the translations on these. These are what a lot of these look like, and you can see they have not fared well. Even though Timbuktu is in a dry location at this time, time has certainly taken its toll. Most people's homes did not have the facilities to store them. At best, they might have been left on shelves like these, but you can't leave manuscripts like this out in the open, as this is the type of thing that happens. So there are still hundreds of thousands of manuscripts in homes. They are not all safe at this time. Sadly, Timbuktu and Mali are still very troubled areas. And if you look at the US State Department's advice on travel is concerned, their word is it's highly dangerous to go there. They're still fighting, there's kidnapping. And even though Timbuktu was nominated and became a UNESCO World Heritage Site, because of these documents and because of the Muslim churches, um, mosques, and other churches in the area, and the very large institutes of learning in Timbuktu, it's not safe. It's not a safe area. The Timbuktu manuscripts have really interested me, and some have been interpreted. I understand the Library of Congress has some, and if I have some time and I'm going to make it, I'd like to find some on astronomy, because I would love to see what they said about astronomy in the year 600 and forward. Europe went into the Dark Ages about 600. Up through the 13th century, intellectual thought, writing, and scholarships were strongly discouraged because they were seen as conflict to the religious views of the church. The written word, observations, and research became scarce. Meanwhile, the Islamic Empire, which stretched from Maine to Middle Africa to Egypt, and its influence actually went further east because Iraq and Iran were involved, entered the golden age of learning. Astronomy became of particular interest to scholars in Iran and Iraq. The math required for astronomy was advanced by Islamic scholars who developed spherical trigonometry and algebra, two forms of math that are basic to calculations of the stars. In the 8th century, the first astronomical observatory was built in Baghdad. Then many others followed in Iraq and Iran. Astronomers of the time created observational sextants, which are critical to study the angle of the sun and movement of the stars and the orbiting of the planets. A book was written, and we'll get into the author in a minute. It's called the Book of Fixed Stars. It was written in Arabic in 964 AD, and unfortunately, the original book did not survive. However, there are copies. There's at least 15 copies, the oldest of which is in the Bodleian Library at the University of Oxford in England. Is dated 1009 AD. In this Book of Fixed Stars, there are constellations. Some may not be current constellations, but these are the constellations that they were looking at. Some of these are current. You may recognize some. But in the Book of Fixed Stars, a chart was drawn up for each constellation. 48 different constellations were identified in the north and south hemispheres. And every star in the constellation was charted. Its location, latitude, and longitude was noted. The brightness of the star was noted, and the star was numbered in each of these constellations. This is an example of the type of work that is in the Timbuktu manuscripts. Much remains today to tell us and to show us what it was like to live in the area and go to these universities. These are pictures of universities, either in art, which is on tiles and has survived, and to study in universities. Some of these universities still stand, and some of these are even in use today, over 1,000 years after what they were when they were founded. The author of the Book of Fixed Stars was a gentleman by the name of Al Sulfi. He was not only an astronomer, but he seemed to be very versed in physiology, because his work eventually aided in the development, after his death, of course, but in the development of the telescope. He was the one who first found, or first noted, how vision works. It was thought at the time, old thinking was that light came out of the eyes and illuminated the area in front of people. Al-Haytham showed, and if you look at this chart, that light goes into the eyes, through a nerve path, and into the brain. And it shows the parts of the eye rather well for something that, you're looking about medicine that was 1,000 years old. So this is one of the great scholars of the time. Ahmad al-Rahman al-Salfi was born in 903 and died in 986. He lived in the Persian Empire. He translated Greek astronomical works and was the first to mention the Andromeda galaxy and the Large Magellanic Galaxy. It's thought that he was the first to identify those as galaxies, even though certainly at this time there were no telescopes. And he also wrote the Book of Fixed Stars. He's a very prolific gentleman. Okay. I'd like to move to South Africa now. Just a little bit of history. One of the first signs of, I would say, current settlement and artistic work was found in a place called Blombos Cave. It's on the coast of South Africa. It's about almost on the ocean. This is the entrance to the cave. It's about 35 feet above sea level. And actually, the cave had numerous periods of occupation by people, some of them over 100,000 years ago. The cave was occupied and abandoned at least 3 or 4 times, depending when sea level rose. There was water and sand washed in and out of the cave, obviously. But what was left is amazing. We're talking about artwork which shows geometric shapes that's been dated as 73,000 years old. And the fact that they knew about the triangle at that point and other geometric shapes which aren't as easy to see is kind of amazing. They were well versed in how to make stone items, arrows, spears, knives, scraping stones. And I think the most amazing part to me, this is partially blocked by our Um, I don't know if you can see this. Bob, can you see the right side of the screen? I don't know if he's with me right now.
Yeah, we can. Yeah, we can.
Okay. All
Yeah,
right.
where your arrow is. Yes. Mhm.
Okay. The physiology on some of these horses is absolutely amazing. And to think that people that long ago had the skills to draw that is just gorgeous. These are throughout the cave. So this is one of the first signs of habitation by an active people who came and went depending upon sea level. But they are still working in this cave. They've only been working in it for about 30 years, and they keep making, the further down they go, the more they're finding. Some of the artwork clearly shows that people of the time were looking at the stars, were looking at the sky. Here you see them obviously looking at and amazed by a comet in the sky, depictions of the sun. And these are type of a landscape of people, again, looking up at the sky. It's the ochre has run some, but it's kind of a panorama of people looking up at the sky. I'm going to jump up to Egypt real quickly here because I haven't talked much about Egypt today. And Egypt is a whole other type of presentation on astronomy. It's a different kind of astronomy. But just to show that people's observing the sky is common throughout the world, really. But the ancient Egyptians obviously worshiped the sun. They knew about the phases of the moon. They came out, they looked at the stars at night, and they clearly identified constellations in the sky, whether they be different or the same as the ones that we look at. Okay, now we're going to get into a little bit of astronomy. Okay. I want to talk to you about the electromagnetic spectrum. Now, the electromagnetic spectrum is the forces and the power that come out of the sun. And I'm talking about light, X-rays, radio, microwave, infrared, and ultraviolet energy. It's all different types of energy transmitted by not just our sun, but by every star in the sky. The part that, oops, I'm really having trouble. Electromagnetic spectrum that we see is right here. It's between ultraviolet and infrared. This is the visible spectrum. Photons come out of the sun. We see it as light, but it's important that we look at this and know what it is, because we're going to go into a part of the spectrum that is not being looked at or has not been looked at very much in the past, but we're going to, I'm sorry. The Hubble telescope sees things in the electromagnetic spectrum, in the visible spectrum. It sees it right here. And it sees a little bit of infrared as well. It's important that we have telescopes that let us see all parts of the energy that are actually in them. And this energy comes through as light. So Hubble sees light as we see it, and it also sees the infrared. Infrared is generated as heat, and we feel infrared as heat from the sun. What I want to talk about today is radio energy and a little bit about the John West Space Telescope. You've seen a lot of publicity come out since July 12th, and some of the beautiful pictures that the John West Telescope is generating. Well, we've just begun to see the best of what's available now. So we're going from the visible spectrum to the infrared, and we're going to be talking about radio waves. It's important that we know what we're looking at when we're looking at a galaxy, for example. Galaxies have star areas, areas of new stars, gas, which is really important to the generation of new stars in it. All of these areas of energy are coming out of every star in the sky. So we're going to be talking about radio astronomy for the rest of our discussion. There's two major constructions or parts of what we look at in a telescope like Hubble. These are galaxies. Most galaxies are spiral galaxies, such as this. These are other spiral galaxies. These three, this is called a globular cluster. Some of the oldest stars in the universe are in globular clusters. And again, a spiral galaxy. Spiral galaxies have usually a very hot center of some of the first stars where it was formed. Gravity pulls in other materials, basically gas and dust, and you'll see dust and gas lanes in between the arms of the galaxy. I'm sorry, this is partially blocked by my picture here, but you can see dust lanes in every galaxy where you can get a close picture. Dust is the stuff that stars are made of, literally stardust. The other major structure in the universe are nebulas, which are huge accumulations of gas and dust. Some of them are very colorful. The dust we look at for star formation is usually dark, like these. This is cold gas, and where they've got cold gas, this is where stars are born. Cold gas will collapse, and I'll show you this graphically in just a minute, but it's quite heavy. It will collapse and form a star. When enough gas collects and the weight of the star becomes extreme, it ignites, and I want to get into that right now. When enough gas collects, it starts to spin, and when it spins, it forms a disk. The dust and the gas has weight, pulls itself into the center. Actually, gravity pulls gas into the middle, eventually forms a star, and you reach a critical mass where the weight of the gas and dust ignites a thermonuclear reaction, and the star ignites. As that is happening, it starts to clear lanes around the outside, and that's where you start to get planetary formation. This is called a protoplanetary disk. And protoplanetary disks form near and far. These are a few relatively near us in the Milky Way galaxy. These are all star and planetary systems which are in formation. This is about 15 or 20 of the very closest ones to us. These are near us. And the way it works is like this. Typically, you get a rotation, the pulling in of gas in the disk into the middle until enough critical mass is reached and the star ignites. Planets start to form in what is left over from the formation of the sun. And I think you can see in here, I thought I saw a planet forming here, but I'm sorry. Here is one where planets have already formed, and they are starting to clear out a lane around them too. If you remember what our solar system looks like, the lanes between the planets are pretty clean of rock and other things left over from the formation of the solar system, with the exception of the asteroid belt, where a lot of that material has accumulated and has been attracted by Jupiter's gravity. So you get a period of star formation through gravity, attracting a critical mass of dust and gas until there's ignition, clearing of the lanes, planet formation. And this is happening to virtually every star that we've looked at in our search for exoplanets, or the planets that are forming in star systems not of our own, but other star systems in the Milky Way and in other galaxies as well. This is how planets are formed. This is how star and planetary systems are formed. So it's important that we be able to see all parts of this. We cannot see into dust clouds with a visual telescope like Hubble. However, by using an infrared telescope like the James West Telescope or a radio telescope, we can look into galaxies that are obscured by a lot of dust and gas and see where the star formations are going, the star and planetary formations are happening. Now, so we're talking about radio astronomy. Now, what are radio telescopes? Just as optical telescopes collect visible light, they bring it into focus, amplify it, and make it available for analysis by various instruments. So do radio telescopes collect weak radio light waves, bringing it into focus, amplifying it, and making it available for analysis. We use radio telescopes to study naturally occurring radio light from stars. And yes, radio waves do come in as light. We study galaxies, black holes, and other astronomical objects. We can also use them to transmit and reflect radio light off of planetary bodies in our solar system. These specially designed telescopes observe the longest wavelengths of light, ranging from 1 millimeter to over 10 meters long. For comparison, visible light waves are only a few hundred nanometers long, and a nanometer is only 1/10,000th the thickness of a piece of paper. In fact, we don't usually refer to radio light by wavelength, but by its frequency. Naturally occurring radio waves are extremely weak by the time they reach us from space. A cell phone signal is a billion times more powerful than cosmic waves that our telescopes detect. Because radio waves are so long and cosmic radio sources extremely weak, radio telescopes are the largest telescopes in the world. Only the most sensitive radio receivers are used inside them. Unfortunately, these huge antennas only pick up radio interference, also pick up radio interference from modern electronics, and great effort is taken to protect radio telescopes from radio frequency interference. And I will tell you, we're going up to see a radio telescope in Green Bank, West Virginia, sometime in the fall. And it's a radio and phone-free area. They don't even allow the neighbors to have Wi-Fi in their homes. And that clear area goes for quite a few 100 miles around them. It's a very large clear area so that these telescopes, that these dishes can operate interference-free. I want to show you the sky as radio telescopes see it. These are things that we can't see or we have discovered because of radio telescopes. We looked at Mercury about 20 years ago, wanted to see what Mercury looked like, what the surface really looked like. We could see it pretty well when it wasn't too, like early in the morning or in the evening, when it wasn't behind the sun or in front of the sun. Mercury is a little hard to look at because of its closeness to the sun. Mercury, because of its proximity to the sun, is a hot place. The average temperature on the surface, the sunny side of Mercury, is about 800 degrees Fahrenheit. We wanted to see if perhaps there was some water or had been water on Mercury. So we shined a radio telescope on it. And what we found, this is what you're looking at is the North Pole of Mercury. And Mercury is very heavily cratered. There is no atmosphere to speak of any kind. So incoming meteors and a stray asteroid have been hitting it for 4.5 billion years, as long as the solar system's been around, and is heavily pockmarked. And of course, that's true with the top of Mercury at the pole. It's heavily caverned there, and the red is a reflection. And when we first saw it, we thought that's the reflection that water has. How is that possible? Well, these caves and these meteor craters, some of them are very deep and in shadow all the time, being at the North Pole, particularly so. We looked at other places in the solar system, specifically on one of the moons of Jupiter, Europa. It is ice covered, and the same ice reflection that we saw on Europa is on Mercury. So in an 800-degree environment outside of the craters, there is water ice inside the craters. So the radio telescopes turned into be an excellent exploratory instrument. We look at if these look like those protoplanetary disks, they are. We found them in a good number of places where we use radio telescopes. This is in the Orion molecular cloud. It's a good distance away. It's about 50 light years or 300 trillion miles away from us. And we can see with returning radio waves that it is just full. We found over 300 protoplanetary disks or star and planetary systems forming in this cloud. Also, we found a black hole. This is the Hercules A black hole. Well, you can't see it. You can see the jets coming out of it. The black hole is right here. You can see dust and gas circling it before it falls into the black hole, and then the energy is expelled at either end of it. Again, we have not been able to see it with a visual telescope like Hubble, but we see it quite clearly. We see these quite clearly with a radio telescope. So you can see the advantage that radio telescopes have for us. Now, looking at radio telescopes that are around and have been around for about 50 years, actually radio telescopes, the first ones were built, very small ones in the 1930s, Germany in 1971, Crimea, you wonder what's happened to this in the Ukraine now, a 70-meter telescope in 1978, Jodrell Bank, a really famous radio telescope in England, the 305-meter, this used to be the largest radio telescope in the world. The 305-meter telescope in Arecibo, Puerto Rico, was built in 1963. Unfortunately, this telescope collapsed on December 1st, 2020. It was an enormous loss for the world because it was one of the best and most prolific telescopes of its time. They're still looking for the reasons that it collapsed, but I think the fact that Puerto Rico has had some enormous hurricanes in the last few years, specifically. They've had earthquakes. They've had two very serious earthquakes prior to this collapse. It's also was built and attached. Well, let me tell you what happened. This is the heart of the telescope right here. It's where all the radio waves bounce up and are received by this receiver right here. This is the part that collapsed. The towers failed, the cables failed, and it fell down into the dish. And the telescope is ruined and will not be reconstructed. They're talking about perhaps building a new one, but the telescope was built in a sinkhole of limestone or karst. And I'm wondering if there was some settling of the area where these towers were anchored. And unfortunately, this was something that cost many hundreds of millions of dollars in the 1960s and would undoubtedly be a multi-billion-dollar reconstruction project. So they are talking about what to do about it, and it'll probably be some time before action is taken. China finished a major construction project and built a 500-meter radio telescope. It was finished in 2016. It actually came online about 3 years ago, and they've made some interesting finds with it. A radio telescope is pretty much as I discussed before. You've got a big dish receiver. It bounces the radio waves to another receiver right here, which consolidates the waves and sends them down to computers into the buildings that operate the telescope. Now, let's talk about what's going on now. South Africa has become a hot area as far as radio telescopy is concerned. Why? Well, they have some very dry areas, as we saw on the map of Africa. Uh, some of them are quite high, very low humidity. They're flat, and it's important to make sure you've got very good alignment, and rugged topography would not allow for it. And they've built huge arrays of radio telescopes in South Africa. That's a program that is just getting started, yet you can see these are serious arrays. And I'll tell you why they use arrays. We'll get into that just a couple of minutes. But Switzerland financed this and had it built in South Africa with 1,000 reflectors. UC Berkeley has sponsored this is hidden from me, I think it's about 300 reflectors in another type of array. Socorro, New Mexico has some huge radio reflectors. These are some of the biggest in the business. The Atacama Desert in Chile, this is the driest place in the world, has 54 and 12 meter reflectors at an elevation of 16,000 feet. Very dry area, very level, and the viewing is always good. But one of the advantages of a radio telescope is not just that you have a flat, dry area, because you can use a radio telescope day or night, clouds or no clouds. But we have a lot of other telescopes in the Atacama Desert, actually in the lower Andes Mountains, visual telescopes using the visual spectrum, as well as radio telescopes now. Radio telescopes come in several different ways. You can see an anchored radio telescope. It is articulated. It can move in any direction. It can turn, and it can tip. And again, it's good any type of weather, low clouds or not. It doesn't make a lot of difference. You'll see a couple of radio telescopes on tracks here. It's important when you have a large array and a large telescope that you be able to focus it, particularly when you're using these in groups. And by moving them apart, you can increase your focus. So a lot of these are built on tracks and have tractors come and move them, depending on what they're looking at, what they're looking for. The square kilometer array is, bear with me a second. In conjunction with Australia, South Africa, a number of 8 cooperating African countries, India, China, Japan's in this now, New Zealand, and Canada, and select European countries, Italy, France, Germany, Sweden, and the UK. They are building enormous arrays of radio telescopes, 2 types, the dishes that we've just spoken about, and dipole antennas. These dipole antennas serve as very adequate, very good receivers of the shorter waves, and then mid waves are received by the dishes. This is an international effort, and about 40% of the world's population is involved with this SKA project. I'm trying to consolidate this so we can do it quickly. The advantages of large groups of dishes are that if you took the total area of all the screens involved and put it in one telescope, it would be way too big. The biggest dish that can be manipulated and controlled very accurately is about 100 meters across. So they've taken these into arrays. And what is equally interesting is that the further you spread these out, this is called a baseline array. And a baseline array between South Africa and Australia is better than 6,000 miles long. The greater the distance and the more different dishes that you have, the greater the viewing power or the seeing power of this is. We are going to be including dishes and dipole antennas in the other African countries. Canada will be contributing, and I think we might see the United States come in at some time in the future, although we have a lot of them in the Atacama display in the Chilean desert where we're operating now. So right now we have in operation 200 dish mid-frequency telescopes in South Africa, 130,000 low frequency antennas in Australia. The total viewing area, and we say it's a square kilometer display. Well, a square kilometer is almost 11 million square feet of display. So you can see what it does as far as viewing area is concerned. This is the largest, this array becomes the largest radio telescope in the world. It's really exciting. The things they are going to find and are looking at now are extraordinary. And that's the end of the presentation. I've enjoyed talking to you, and I'd be interested in any questions or discussions that we have.
So anyone that has comments or questions, Judy had a question about are globular galaxies older than spiral galaxies? Are all globular galaxies older than spiral galaxies? And anyone else is welcome to, we'll get to you in a second here. Kathy can get you on screen. Can you answer that question?
Yes.
Okay, hold on a second.
The globular galaxies are the oldest galaxies in the universe. They have some of the oldest stars in the universe with them. Virtually all of them have extreme age on them. There's a few 100,000 to a few million stars in a globular galaxy. They're very closely held together in a close mass by gravity. They have not spread out like the big spiral galaxies that we see. They might be a few 100,000 light years across versus hundreds of millions of light years across, as opposed to a spiral galaxy. Did I answer that question?
I think so. For me, you did. I hope you did for Judy. And Judy, you're welcome to unmute. Kathy, we've got you on screen, and also Pat. Kathy, did you have a comment or question for Mike?
Well, Mike, thank you so much. I actually had the good fortune of being in Namibia, Botswana, and South Africa because my daughter was in the Peace Corps in Namibia for 3 years. So I got to go. And I'm just wondering, the stone circles where you started the conversation, there was already, number one, a technology to build the stone circles, and then the awareness to put them in a structure, in a formation that would work with the stars. Do you feel that that knowledge came from the stars, or that was an innate development of humanity?
I'm sorry, state your, I heard your statement in full, but your question didn't come through.
My question is, do you feel that that development to create monuments that aligned with the stars, that knowledge came from viewing the stars, or maybe they were influenced by the star people? Most ancient civilizations, most indigenous, have a star people story, mythology.
Yes. I'm a little bit ambiguous on that. My personal feeling is, you know, we've from various populations, we've heard stories of, we've had visitors from elsewhere,
Right.
and some of that is because of some very, very interesting, huge artworks and geometric designs out in the desert, and that would have been, because of their size and scope, impossible for the people of old ages to do. So I'm not denying anything. I think anything could be possible, and if that's ambiguous, I'm sorry, but
Oh, no, that's just you being
I
a
think it's
politician,
possible.
Mike.
Sounds like a
Well,
new
okay,
age
so-
person, new age person talking to a politician is what we got.
Yeah, he really danced that one. Well, I mean, 26,000 years ago, the Earth axis actually changed, and that's what caused a lot of the change in temperatures and climate in Africa. I mean, the pyramids, actually, the Nile was right by the pyramids, and now it's way far away. So when you showed that map of the climate change, I mean, there's been 26,000 years. We're about due for another
Well,
one of those.
you know, you hit a really good point, and it's a point that I left out of the presentation because I knew it was getting too long.
Oh,
But yes, the Earth is wobbles a little bit. It wobbles about 3.5 degrees, and it goes through a cycle of about, it takes 41,000 years for it to do that wobble.
oh, I
Okay.
thought it was 26,000. It's
Well,
41.
yeah, the 41 is the number that I've got, and
Okay.
that 3.5 degree swing definitely caused not only a climate change in Africa, but the same type of thing happened all over the world,
Right.
whether it be more humid or less humid, or going from tropical to temperate, or temperate to subarctic. We've seen all those records of precession like that. Yes.
Okay. And then I have one other thing, and I'll stop. I got to interview this father-son group, dynamic duo from Australia, and they had stones very similar to the stone you had in the picture that had the geometric shapes on it.
Yeah.
And they're Aboriginal people actually kept these stones, and some of them actually, they're saying they were cut by laser. There's no way that they can explain the designs on them, and there's some sort of granite and silica, and actually 3 of the stones that Evan and Stephen Strong they actually call the Aboriginals call them killing stones. So when you showed that picture, it was like, whoa.
Boy, I'd sure like to read more about that. That's
Right,
interesting.
I can connect you if you want.
That would be
Yep.
wonderful.
I've gotten to interview them before. It's so fantastic. Yeah,
Wow.
there's so much we don't know.
Well,
Yeah,
you know, you think a little bit about the Aboriginals, and not to get off track here and use up too much time, but you think about the Aboriginals and their walkabouts and the way that they can just go and with no visual guidance, but some kind of guidance. And I think it's got to be stars again, folks.
Right, right.
They get where they're going and they go some long distances.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, thank you.
Oh,
Thank you for that conversation, Kathy.
Thank you.
It was interesting this morning with our meditation group. We had after conversation and mentioned about tonight. Some of them actually were watching on Facebook tonight and talked about the evolution of consciousness and why is it that we are so arrogant that we think that we're the most advanced of consciousness of all of humanity. How could it, maybe that's not really true, or different elements at different times back through these thousands of years you're talking about tonight, Mike. So it's really something to ponder. We have a question. Sheila has a question for you in the chat. For you, Mike, are the SKAs being installed in all the partner countries, or the partners are supporting them in specific locations? And what do we think we might hope to find? Like, what is the goal of, that's a lot of cash been spent all over the world and cooperation. What are the goals?
Yeah, you're talking about many billions. The African countries will be building dishes and or dipole antennas, depending upon the need. Yes. Will they be building millions of them? No. There is a projection that they will come out with over 1 million dipole antennas. Those are the short little ones in the desert. You're talking about hundreds of other dish antennas going to be built. Yes. The discussion on the SKA goes back 30 years. It's just it was just approved 2 or 3 years ago. And they're using some existing arrays that are already there. The distance between the arrays is not important. The longer the baseline, the more accuracy and better vision that this giant conglomeration of telescopes has. So as far as countries like Canada, in Europe, I think there's a lot of scientific support. There's an enormous amount of scientific support for this project. This will be the biggest radio telescope in the world. And I think it is going to grow over time.
Is it about broad exploration though, or are there specific goals intended?
I haven't seen anything on this yet. I can pull up that information and get it to you. I think there probably is. They're not going to go wandering in the desert on it. There'll definitely be goals. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So it would provide more information than the James Webb. So
it will provide different information than the James Webb. In other words, looking at protoplanetary disks, for example, we can see some of the energy coming from them, but not the radio energy coming from them.
Oh.
But now we can. You saw some radio pictures of those little red dots were protoplanetary disks. We need to, I don't know if they're focusing the existing SKA on them at this point. There is one other area that we didn't touch, and I just want to mention it because it's an interest to me. You're familiar with the SETI program, SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. The radio telescopes are the ones that they really use to pick up these weak radio signals from other galaxies. The one at Green Bank is heavily invested in that. That's National Science Foundation. There's other telescopes that they're using for it. Unfortunately, about 15 years ago, the government stopped funding it. So it's all private funding going on now. That's disturbing to me. Because I think there's life out there. It's just a matter of finding it.
Right.
So at any rate, we're headed up to see that telescope, and we're going to see a Set A presentation by
Oh,
one
it's
of
Stephen
the-
Greer?
I'm sorry, the
What be
Green
with
Bank,
Stephen? Will it
the
be with
Green
Stephen
Bank,
Greer?
the Green Bank, West Virginia radio telescope.
Oh,
Cool.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, we're going to close soon, but I want to give an opportunity to anyone else
well,
that might.
okay, I do have
Noel?
one question.
Okay, Noel has a question.
Okay, in South Africa, have you ever heard of Adam's calendar?
I'm sorry, the what calendar?
Adam's calendar.
No, I haven't.
It's a stone formation, right, Noel?
Stone formation, kind of discovered or described by Michael Tellinger. He's a South African. And it actually, you can tell the days of the year with this stone calendar. So I might send you something about the Adams calendar.
Do you remember from the FACE fan club there in Boulder, Colorado?
Oh.
Kathy, do you know what whether you recall how old that was? You're friends with Mike Tellinger, you know him.
I don't, but I was talking about him again this morning. I think the work that Michael Tellinger does might really interest you,
Yeah,
Mike,
Mike.
and he
Yeah.
might be a great connection for information for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I'd really be interested to what that
Yeah.
calendar is dated.
Yeah.
Right. And then Mike, how old was the oldest human skeletal remains that you found? That you shared with us?
Wait, let me think.
Hmm.
In the area of, including some current ones, 7,000 to 9,000 years old. You're talking about it, not to play a, or
Okay.
is that where you're talking about?
Well, yeah, but I want to talk about Mungo Man and Lady discovered in skeletal remains discovered in Africa dating
No,
Australia 45,000 years ago. And we're real good friends with the son of the man who discovered them. I want to send you some information on that because I think that would you'd really be interested in that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be interesting in the in that cave in South Africa that I
Yeah, that
knew
was fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, that goes back at least 74,000 years, carbon dating.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah, that was fascinating.
Wow. Wow. Wow.
Well, I don't think we have any time for anything else, but
Yeah. Well, we're gonna wrap up. We really appreciate everyone being here this evening. Such an amazing amount of research, Mike, and obviously your lifetime avocation shows through the amount of research that you put in, not just to this presentation, but that you've done for many, many years. We really appreciate you bringing this gift to us this evening.
I learned a lot.
Yeah, and
Thank you. I've enjoyed being here with you.